Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of an introduction to public financial disclosure. I'm Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. The statutory requirements of the Public Financial Disclosure Program are actually quite extensive and complex. They require that you have systems and policies and procedures in place to identify public financial disclosure filers and notify them of their reporting requirements, to ensure that they file their reports in a timely way, and to make sure that you have an adequately trained staff to conduct reviews and certifications of those reports. You also have to manage those reports according to records management practices, and when requested by the public, you have to have a system in place for making some of those documents publicly available. That's a lot. So today, in order to help you, we're going to be taking a look at some of the tools that OGE has available to help you do those various and sundry roles and responsibilities that inhere in your public financial disclosure program. We're going to start with OGE's publicly facing website, www.oge.gov. OGE's website is a repository of many, many resources for you. Here you're going to find all of the legal authorities that you will need to be familiar with in order to conduct both your technical reviews and your substantive reviews. There are OGE advisories that we issue periodically dealing specifically with public financial disclosure that are housed in our advisory tab. There are also education and training materials that are available to you to get your staff and yourselves well trained up on the requirements of the review and certification of public financial disclosure. And of course, we have resources that are dedicated explicitly and exclusively to public financial disclosure, and that is found under the Financial Disclosure tab on our website. The public financial disclosure forms that employees are required to file are located here in our OGE Forms library. Now these are hard copy, if you will, versions of the forms, and this is for those folks who aren't using Integrity, which is the electronic filing system that OGE created. If you are using Integrity and are electronically filing and reviewing, then integrity.gov is the place where you should go to learn more about the processes and procedures and the ways in which Integrity operates. And within Integrity itself, there are a battery, a repository of resources and tools that you can access within Integrity itself. So if you are in Integrity on your landing page and you're finding as you're conducting a review that you need some assistance, there is a help function, and within that help function, you can find links to the resources that you will need to help you do whatever you need to do once you're actually in the system. And that includes accessing the max.gov page, where there are even further resources with respect to helping you navigate Integrity, whether you're a filer or a reviewer or an administrator. In addition to those resources, one of the resources we're going to be spending most time with today, and certainly in part 3, are the Public Financial Disclosure Guide. But there are some additional resources for public financial disclosure that are also located on this same tab. Now, the Public Financial Disclosure Guide is effectively the guide which contains the 2634 program requirements, particularly as they address filing of 278Es and 278Ts. The guide, which is an electronic form on our website, is also available in PDF. So there might be some of you who would like to have both versions available. I know for some folks, searching in PDF is easier, but I just wanted you to be certain that you were aware that there are 2 different versions of this that you can avail yourself of, depending upon what structure you prefer. When you open the Public Financial Disclosure Guide, you'll see to your left there, these tabs are directed to and written for filers to assist them in filling out their 278E or their 278T. And at the bottom of that list of tabs, there's a tab for you, the ethics official. And when you open that, it opens up a separate table of contents that run parallel to the table of contents for filers. Now, within this table of contents, there are some sections that deal more with administrative aspects of filing as opposed to specifically the various parts of the 278E or the 278T. So these reside in Section 1, which deals with types of reports and filing deadlines, individuals who are required to file, forms and methods of filing, extensions, late filing fees, failure to file or falsification, and written procedures. And in a moment, I'm going to walk through that portion of the guide and highlight some additional information that's there. Section 4 also has some administrative types of guidelines with respect to the filing and management of the 278E and the 278T. And this is dealing with the public availability of reports, records management of those reports, forwarding those reports to OGE for those reports that are required to be forwarded to OGE. And there are some special procedures that apply to nominees to presidential appointments that require Senate confirmation. With respect to the technical review of the 278E and the 278T, Sections 2 and 3 are the sections that deal specifically with instructions for filling out and for reviewing Sections 2 and 3. We are going to be covering Sections 2 and 3 in Part 3. So we will be going into much greater detail about each of the separate parts of Section 2 in Part 3. For your substantive review, OGE has a series of guides that analyze potential conflicts of interest. And the analyses in each of these guides addresses discrete types of holdings or particular ways in which someone could have a financial interest that could create a conflict of interest. So we have a guide that deals with analyzing conflicts that arise from the holding of certain assets, that arise from private investment funds and employment with an investment fund, that arise from liabilities, common employment interests, business or farm ownership, corporate employment, law firm or consulting employment, employment with institutions of higher education, and related research, speaking, and writing activities. You can find these guides from our homepage if you click on Financial Conflicts of Interest as a topic that's on the homepage. The Analyzing Potential Conflicts of Interest guides, the link to those guides is located there. In addition to those resources, the Institute for Ethics in Government has a resource library that has a variety of distance learning, videos, materials, and job aids that you can use for your own professional development with respect to improving your technical and your substantive knowledge and skills for purposes of performing your review functions with public financial disclosure. So now I want to highlight some sections 1 parts to give you just a little bit of additional information about what you'll find within that section. Section 1 talks about the types of reports and the filing deadlines for those reports. Now, there are a variety of reports that have different triggering events that require someone to report, and those different reporting events have different deadlines, which involve day counting. So for your nominees, there are certain triggering events and deadlines for people who have been nominated to a presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed position. Your new entrant reports are going to be for those people who are newly entering a public filing position. That might be someone who is newly coming into government, but quite often it also involves folks who are simply being promoted from one government position to another, or whose duties are changing, and they now encumber a position that requires reporting. There is, of course, annual filing requirements every May 15th for people who have encumbered a filing position for more than 60 days, for 60 days or more in the preceding calendar year. And then there is a termination report requirement, which is triggered by a person leaving a covered public filing position, whether or not that also means they're leaving federal service. For purposes of the annual reporting deadlines, this is another resource that you want to be aware of. Every year, OGE issues a program advisory which explicitly discusses the deadlines for the annual reports for that annual reporting cycle. We issued this program advisory back in April, on April 2nd, and you can find those advisories here on OGE's website under the OGE Advisory tab. Section 1 also addresses who is required to file a public financial disclosure report. Now, this is a statutorily based system, so unlike the confidential financial disclosure system where the agency has great discretion to decide who files, there are some instances of flexibility in the statutory system, but for the most part, the statute dictates who has to file. One of the largest groups of filers that you're going to be dealing with in your public financial disclosure system are the ones who fall within this definition, and more specifically, are those who are paid under a system that is other than the general schedule and whose rate of basic pay is 120% of the rate of basic pay for a GS-15. Now, that seems to be a pretty complicated definition, and it involves math. So OGE does not expect you to do the math. So again, every year after the pay tables have been supplied by OPM, OGE issues a legal advisory where we have done the calculation of the 120% of the minimum rate of basic pay for the GS-15 of the general schedule. So for effective January 5th, 2020, for the 2020 calendar year, that threshold is $131,239. Now, as I said, there are some flexibilities that are provided in the statute that extend beyond the definitions of covered position. One of them is the concept of equal classification determinations. And this is where your agency may have positions, people who are encumbering positions that are equal to the types of positions that normally would be required to file a public financial disclosure report. In those instances, if you feel that these are people who should be filing a public financial disclosure report, you can request an equal classification determination from the Office of Government Ethics, and that is explained in this part of Section 1. Likewise, there is an exclusion element in the statute for people who serve for 60 days or less in positions that would otherwise require public financial disclosure filing. There are a variety of circumstances and considerations that have to be made, including day counting. How do you count what constitutes 60 days or less? That is all discussed in Section 1 of the guide. Similarly, there are exclusion provisions for Schedule C positions. Now, what this means is that the predicate is that people who encumber Schedule C positions, by definition, are supposed to file a public financial disclosure report. However, there is an exclusion provision that allows, in the first instance, agencies to make a written determination that certain employees who are at or below the GS-13 grade level do not have certain types of responsibilities that would require them to file a public financial disclosure report. And the agency has the discretion to make those determinations for those grade level positions. For employees who encumber, Schedule C employees who encumber positions that are above the GS-13 rate, any request for an exclusion from filing would have to come to OGE for our determination. Section 1 also talks about how we handle and how we deal with a variety of different types of employees, including special government employees, particularly those who serve on federal advisory committees, detailees, and particularly detailees who come to us under the Intergovernmental Personnel Act. Section 1 also discusses filing extensions. As we know, filing extensions are within the purview of the agency to approve. This discusses when those determinations have to be in writing. It discusses what form the request must take and what form the approval must take. And most importantly, it gives you some baseline understanding of what constitutes a good cause for approving a filing extension that someone might request. Section 1 also discusses late filing fees. And in this instance, it's discussing when and how do you give notice of the late filing fee to the filer, how do you collect the late filing fee, and how do you waive the late filing fee. There are also penalties for failing to file, and this is distinguishable from a late filing fee. If you have recalcitrant employees who willfully fail to file, who file false information, or who willfully fail to provide information that's required to be provided on the report, there is recourse that the agency can take, and that's discussed here. The agency certainly can take disciplinary action on its own, but it also can make referrals to the Department of Justice for either civil action or potentially criminal action. So there is recourse when you have a filer who willfully fails to file, falsifies information, or willfully fails to provide information that's required to be disclosed on the report. Finally, we discuss written procedures in Section 1. And written procedures are really critical. And I've given you a copy of the original diagram that went out in 1992 describing what your written procedure should contain. I know that for some folks it may seem like it is administrative minutia that we're engaging in with written procedures, but I assure you they're critical. They're critical for succession planning. They're critical to make sure that everyone who has a role in this very multifaceted system understands what the role is, understands who's responsible for what. And particularly, if you're the designated agency ethics official or the ADAO and you're leaving your position, you want to make sure that the person who follows in behind you is not having to completely reinvent those policies and procedures. And just as kind of a matter of heads up, written procedures are something that the program review group at OGE will be keenly interested in seeing when they come in to evaluate your program for compliance with applicable law and regulation. So if you don't have written procedures, you should probably get them. If you do have written procedures, you should probably periodically revisit them to make sure that they're up to date and to make sure that they really reflect the way that you conduct and operate your public financial disclosure system. So in part 3, as I said, we're going to be discussing specifically review and certification. We're going to be looking at Section 2 of the Public Financial Disclosure Reviewer's Guide so that we can become familiar with the requirements of the review of the OGE 278E.